So I'm going to just introduce Anne Morgan, who is facilitating the conversation, and then she is going to introduce everybody else. I'm Edward Einhorn. I run Untitled Theater Company number 61, and I wrote and directed Alma, Baya. And so Anne is a dramaturg, literary manager, and new play advocate. She serves as programs director for the National New Play Network, an alliance of professional theaters that collaborate in innovative ways to develop, produce, and extend the life of new plays. And works regularly at the Playwrights Lab at Hollins University, at the Great Plains Theater Conference, where I met her, the Playwrights Realm, the Kennedy Center, and more, as well as collaborating with playwrights individually. She currently serves as board co-chair for Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas. And received the 2019 Elliott Hayes Award for Outstanding Achievement in Dramaturgy for work on Shakespeare's New Contemporaries, the American Shakespeare Center's groundbreaking new play initiative, while at ASC, and dramaturg new plays by Mary Elizabeth Hamilton, Angel Felicia King, Emma Whipday, and Amy E. Whitting. From 2012 to 2017, and was the literary manager and dramaturg at the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center, where she worked on new plays by David Auburn, Becca Bernstetter, A. Ray Pamitant, and more. And has worked internationally at the Baltic Playwrights Conference, the Latvian Academy of Culture, and the Lithuanian Academy of Music and Theater, and has taught at the University of Connecticut and the National Theater Institute. So thank you so much for facilitating this conversation, Anne.
Of course, thank you. Wow, I sort of forgot I did all those things, but I have, and here we are. I am so delighted to be here tonight to facilitate this conversation. Really, I'm just super curious and want to hear what you all are thinking about sci-fi theater and how you're making it, and all of that. I'm going to do real lightning round bios, and then as the conversation unfolds, I'll drop your full bios in the chat. So just sort of around the screens as they appear on my Zoom box, Tiffany Keane Scheafer is the artistic director and founder of Otherworld Theater, a two-stage venue in Chicago dedicated to science fiction and fantasy performance. Mac Rogers is the author and co-producer of numerous science fiction dramas for the stage, including the Honeycomb Trilogy, a 3-time New York Times critics pick, Universal Robots, Frankenstein Upstairs, and Ligature Marks. Greg Lamb is a playwright whose space travel play, Last Ship to Proxima Centauri, is making its world premiere in March at Portland Stage Company. And Edward Einhorn, you've just met, playwright, director, translator, librettist, novelist, and artistic director of Untitled Theater Company number 61. I want to start real broad, real basic, sort of how you think about, define, experience sci-fi theater. And in addition to sort of broad picture definition-wise, I'm also curious if you can each tell us about either a project you've made or a project you've seen that you feel is like super emblematic of how you understand sci-fi theater.
I mean, all my life,
I think we lost you for a second there, Greg.
How about now?
You're good.
The internet tends to be unstable sometimes. Yeah, I was just saying that all my life I've consumed sci-fi content of some form or another, very much in a pop culture sense for me, whether it's Star Trek or comics. I often want to say that my playwriting aesthetic is that they're stealth backdoor pilots to Vertigo comics from the 90s that should fit on the bookshelf next to Sandman and Transmetropolitan. But it's just sort of however I do writing. It's just something I'm always going to have as a large percentage of my output, just thinking in that way. Yeah. I don't know. I just don't really think about it as a it's just part of something I will always do.
Oh, okay. Well, so for me, I guess science fiction theater is uh, basically is a way to, a sort of a genre where you're funneling the themes that are natural fits for science fiction through the tools of theater. My approach to science fiction theater has always been uh, to very strongly focus on the fact that I'm creating something for the stage that in no way should be attempting to compete in the same terms with film, television, or audio. That film, television, and audio have their own virtues. The theater has its own unique way of being able to present different genres, and I'm fascinated by using tools that are specific to theater's heritage and the sort of the time-honored techniques of theater to explore science fiction ideas. To talk about another play that I saw that was, I think, a great example of science fiction theater and one that was hugely inspiring to me. I would cite the production I first saw in New York of Carol Churchill's play *A Number*, which was a play about cloning, in which there are two. Well, okay, they're not two characters. I think there are actually four characters that you meet over the course of the play, but three of them are played by one actor, and it was a revelation because I think it's the original human and then two different clones of that human, if I'm remembering the play correctly. It's been many, many years since I saw it, so a lot of the details of the plot have escaped me. But what was particularly inspiring to me about *A Number* was realizing that a potent science fiction idea that might be realized in film or television through the use of complex and expensive visual effects can be realized on stage through the very simple not for the actor, but of chameleonic acting, the very sort of elemental tool of an actor using their talent to shift voice, body language, to basically shift what they're presenting on stage in subtle ways to show that they're playing different characters, but all of them played by the same actor. I had no doubt that I was watching an original and two clones of the same person purely through the kind of time-honored acting choices that go all the way back to the dawn of theater. So that to me is sort of what science fiction theater is.
I have a hard time pinpointing one particular play that I think embodies science fiction. It would be like picking one book that encompasses science fiction or genre. There are different lessons, different stories, different tales. Science fiction is broad. It is a paintbrush in which we can see the consequences of our actions of now. I guess the disembodiment sometimes of what it means to be human or humanity, and hyper-focusing or exacerbating maybe one aspect of humanity and saying what would happen if blank. And I've seen so many great live performances of kind of encapsulating that what if, and that what if is so unique and special, I think, to science fiction, that I would be remiss if I were just to choose one of those what ifs and say this is what makes it science fiction, the epitome of science fiction theater. But that all being said, I will also expand a little bit about what Mac was going for in terms of what it makes it different from film, because I feel like that's the first thing everyone says to me is that why are you trying to compete with film when making science fiction theater, which I think is so silly because theater is live, so it's automatically such a different and special connection that you're having with your audience, of having a one-on-one interaction and you're inviting them into your universe, which film is a screen. It's almost a safer, distant, voyeuristic approach to narrative, which has its pros and cons, just like theater has its pros and cons. But I have always there's always like that inquisitive eyebrow that goes up and goes, why are you doing film if you like genre. And it's, you know, it's like, why are you cosplaying? Like, what a weird question to ask somebody when you're like, this is what I do for a living. Why do it in that genre or that medium? In this medium, you can do all this great, you know, visual things. But theater has always, to me, been the art of transformation, and transformation live, to me, is so special and profound that, and I think that the audience is so with you on a journey, that, you know, they're with you for the ride live, and saying yes and to the experience that you're creating, which is so powerful. And that's why I think, you know, telling these what if stories that affect our community as a whole, always, you know, science fiction is our community. Like, how are we as a society going to grow as humanity? That, you know, I think it is to take it into a communal art form, I think is appropriate.
So my entry into theater in general was through Theater of the Absurd. My brother was obsessed with it when he was in high school, and he was like 10 years older. So he used to read to me these, you know, Waiting for Godot and Rhinoceros or whatever. And I would argue that those are both science fiction theater. You know, and it certainly was the way I absorbed it when I was like 8 or 9. You know, a world where there's a disease that turns people into rhinoceroses, that's clearly science fiction theater. You know, no exit, this weird like room that with all these like surreal rules on it, that's science fiction theater. And I think that, to me, because I was a huge science fiction reader at the time as well, like the things that connected me to both of those things, the plays and the books I was reading, was that it was tackling these like very, you know, complex, like overarching ideas in really interesting ways, and creating these scenarios where like you could really examine something in, like, you know, in this environment that the author has created for an audience. And so that's always been my favorite work. My favorite work is always something that is not live in the real exactly, but it lives in this this created world that is a step away from the real. And so so it seemed not completely natural to do science fiction in theater, and yet there was the stigma when I started out that sort of faded to call it science fiction theater, and then I sort of glided into it by having things that weren't explicitly called science fiction theater. I did this plague play that was set a little in the future, but, you know, could sort of like live in this you know, liminal space between whatever genre it was. And then I started doing adaptations, which were more explicit. But then, you know, my first adaptation with Vonnegut, who himself was afraid to be called science fiction. So yeah, so it's been evolution of being more overt, but it's really the same thing that I've been doing all along.
This is great. Thank you all. You've all like, especially this sort of, as we've gone around the loop, you've sort of really teed me up well for the question that I was already planning to ask next. And I want to, you've talked so eloquently about sort of the importance of theater, of it being theater, right? Why is it theater, not another medium? And I know that at least some of you, if not all of you, do write in other mediums, or make work in other mediums, audio dramas, screenplays, etc. So I'm curious, sort of at the starting point, when you have an idea, what makes you decide to use theater as the medium?
Is it the same order every time, or do we just jump in? Or
Oh no,
I was sure
now
Greg.
it is a free for all. Anybody who wants to jump in can, and you can all just start responding to one another. Yeah, the first one was round the horn, but now we'll just sort of be more casual conversation.
Oh, okay. I'll say for me, very often it just happens due to just the realities of whether it's a gig or a production or whatever it is, that I sort of end up kind of knowing in advance what medium I'm going to be working with. So it's sort of like, for me, it's sort of backwards. I end up, tailoring the idea to the medium. I do get a few ideas where I go, okay, that's obviously definitely supposed to be audio, definitely supposed to be theater, or definitely not supposed to be one of those. Sorry, just as a quick bit of background on me. A couple of years ago, I largely moved from theater into creating scripted podcast dramas. I haven't entirely left theater, and I hope I'll get back to it more in the future. But my focus has largely moved to scripted podcast dramas, partly because that's how I'm making my living, keeping a roof over my head nowadays. So obviously that compels the majority of my focus. But also, it's just where my current area of creative fascination is. But that's not to say that I have left theater behind by any means. I'm currently in the middle of working on a play that has science fiction themes to it, and it's wonderful after a couple of years of not writing stage work to be going back to thinking about storytelling in that form. Where exactly as Tiffany said, that it's live. Where you really are thinking about the interaction, because for me, so much of it is. It was a funny thing moving into audio from stage, because I'd spent so long perfecting thinking about the stage experience when I write. I'd gotten so used to thinking, okay, all right, it's live. Everybody's there sitting in kind of small chairs. They're scrunched up against their neighbor. If I have an intermission, that's putting a lot of pressure on Act Two, because everybody who not only is not sharing the experience with anyone else. A handful of people listen to fiction podcasts, sitting around a table and speakers, but that's very unusual. Most people, they're just by themselves. So having to switch to thinking to a single listener who is like washing the dishes or commuting, driving, or they're on the exercise bike or something like that, that required a massive rethinking of the storytelling. My new motto or my new guideline as a result is, would the scene I just wrote make it easier to get through half an hour on the elliptical? Would the scene I just wrote distract you from the pain you're feeling while exercising? That's the new standard I've set. That's not a standard I ever had with theater, because the realities of theater are completely different. So it's a funny thing to tailor your writing to what you know to be the audience experience when the audience experience has changed so significantly. So I suppose there are probably certain kinds of material that not only are a good fit for the continuous live audience interaction of the stage, but is also a good fit for knowing that your audience is most likely showing up a bit tired. They're most likely thinking about the bottomless library of entertainment waiting for them at home. They're, even setting aside pandemic conditions. I'm just talking about even if you take that out of the equation. So there's sometimes where I'll come across a story idea, and I'll notice that the story has a steadily escalating tension where I'm like, oh, that would work in the theater, because you get them hooked right away, and then you won't. It doesn't have like the story doesn't need a bit in the middle where it slows down for a little bit. It keeps steadily building, which is really good for live, which is really good for keeping an audience that can't escape and can't pause and can't take breaks. You want to kind of keep throwing curveballs that keep tightening the vice around them. Whereas you can you can sometimes take a bit more you can luxuriate a bit more with audio because you know your single listener can pause and go to the bathroom or pick it back up tomorrow. So sometimes it's the tension of the story, and sometimes it's, you know, again, like Tiffany was saying, taking full advantage of the in the room live. And if it's a story that has great beats where you really want those gasps from the audience to be carrying it to the next level, then sometimes those seem like a good fit for the theater as well.
Yeah, just when you write and when you know what you're writing for, you just start to tailor your approach to the story, to the medium. So I've been working on the play that's coming up, Last Ship to Proxima Centauri, which is set on the bridge of a spaceship, and also is in a couple different languages. You have English, and then you have some characters who speak in Chinese and Spanish. And like the dream interaction that I've had is that I'm in a crowded theater watching the play, and then a character makes a comment in Chinese, and the people in the audience who know Chinese start to laugh at it, and everyone looks at them and says, what are they getting? What do they know that I don't know? And so forth. And that's like a particularly theater experience that you're not even going to get in the film as much. It's just having to do with you physically being present, trapped in a room with all these other people, you know, and as we know now, exchanging germs, but let's not think about that right now. Yeah, and I just like, in general, you say you're right, I have written other things in other media, and I like trying to import strengths of one medium to another. Like I've written a play about silent film comedians. I've written a web series about podcasters. I'm writing a stage play about space travel. I like to write things that seem like it should belong to another medium and bring it to this different medium, and just to see what the alchemy there occurs of trying to do a entire big drama, science fiction space opera, but confine it to the bridge of a spaceship.
I do a lot with adaptation, and so I think about moving things between media a lot, and what it means to have, say, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep as a stage play versus the book versus the well-known movie, which is and how could it be specifically theatrical in that moment, and whether it can be theatrical if it's something that can be adapted. And I love that process. I love the sort of transformation, transforming this like book into like a 90-minute play that still feels cohesive and works in its own ways, and is dependent on sort of the magic of having these things happen live, versus the and solidifying things in a very particular way, and at its best it creates sense of like, I can't believe I was transported there, even though I wasn't transported anywhere, and so that's really exciting to me. And I've adapted my own stuff. I've made a couple of plays into audio dramas, and I didn't I wanted it to be an audio drama, not to be a play that I was just then doing on audio. And so a lot of times I think about what that means and how the audience is receiving it differently, and how I'm going to present it differently, and what it means if it's episodic now versus a one contained 80 or 90-minute experience, and what it means if the storytelling comes from the sound, and who's listening and how they're listening. and it's great. And I also do that with opera too. And they're all so different. But they're also, I wrote this book. It's been around for like 10, 12 years. It is a great frustration in my life because it keeps hitting editors who say I really like it, but I don't know how to sell it, so I'm not going to publish it. And so occasionally, as I've hit this wall, I'm like, well, I do theater, I do all these, and now I've started getting into audio, like drama or whatever it is. Like, I adapt things all the time. Can I adapt this into being something else? And sadly, I keep coming up with the answer no. And because there are certain things that really live in a certain world, and the novel is so much about the language of the narrative, that I just can't figure out a way for it to work the way I want it to work in a different medium. Um, and look, in my ideal world, it gets published somewhere, someone else finds it and like, oh, I know exactly what to do with it. When I took City of Glass, the Paul Auster book, which is not science fiction, but is science fiction by my definition. But when I took City of Glass and adapted it for the stage, Paul Auster was like, I don't know how you're going to make this into a stage production. I don't think it necessarily will work as a stage production. And then he came, but he allowed me to do it anyway. And then he came to see it and he was like, oh, it did work in the way that you did it. And I was very proud of myself. And if I could do that for myself, I would be very happy, but I cannot. So yeah, I mean, I think sometimes it really takes like a strong sense of like, this is what it would be, and really let it live in that medium completely. I get frustrated with pieces I feel like are struggling to exist in the medium. They're really something else, and they're not fully committed to like, the medium that they're in.
I'm a theater googie here, I think. I don't really work in other mediums. I think that's because I have a venue space, so I'm always thinking about what's going to work in our venue. And there's also the producer brain as well. That's like, we need to fill space. What shows can we do in our space this year? And so I'm always thinking in terms of live events. I do have a background in just events in general, especially on the fundraising aspect of making really magnificent parties, which is probably kind of where I get that really, really wanting to tackle the five senses every time we do a show. So sight, smell, something that is only you can do really live. I mean, there was one play that was really cool that was virtual, like a virtual presentation. They had a candle that came, they had like a box that came with the play, and it had a candle in it, which I thought was genius. But yeah, thinking like taste, like that's another thing. Like what are we consuming? What are we smelling? Not just visually or hearing, but there are all these other senses that theater can utilize. And that's where I think my event brain came in, because we did that a lot with events of like, if you have this scent in the air, people are more comfortable or will start to relax or feel more at home or feel more rejuvenated. So, it's really funny when I have outside directors, I'm like, okay, but like, what does this planet smell like? Because I want to get, I want to get those scents going. Because it's really transportive, and like even if they don't totally notice it, their brain will. That'll reset their brain. But yeah, in terms of one of the things that Edward said that really resonated with me is staging the impossible. I think that I've encountered that so many times in my career where like, I want to stage this, and they're like, that's impossible. Or are you going to make it campy? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to make it campy. This is Fahrenheit 451. We don't have to make this a campy. No. And so that's just been something that I've encountered a lot in my career of why do you want to stage this thing that's, oh, are you being, and they don't take me serious. And I'm like, no, this is very serious to me. And another thing is that I work a lot with just genre in general because we're science fiction and fantasy. So I'm also getting it from the fantasy side too. Like, I want to do The Hobbit. Oh, well, isn't that a kid's show? Well, yes, but why would you just automatically just up and out say that's lead with that? Like The Hobbit is so much more. And I feel like that sometimes happens with science fiction is that you're just written off as camp or it's not real theater or and that's why it's like there's so many shows that I would say are science fiction and so many shows I would say was fantasy, but you wouldn't be like, oh, Midsummer Night's Dream, isn't that for children? Like you just wouldn't say that. So yeah, I'm definitely dedicated and honed a lot of my expertise into figuring out how to making things experience driven within science fiction and a little bit of fantasy. And I guess if I was to say if I had another medium, I guess I would say events.
It's interesting. For me, the reaction I've gotten from theater people about science fiction theater isn't that they're turning their nose up at it. It's just that they literally haven't occurred to them to do science fiction on theater, on stage. It's just like, oh, it never occurred to me to do that before we read your scripts or something like that. And it's just, I don't know. It's just the type of writing that comes natural to me. But yeah, just it's exciting, unexplored space, really, to do all these genre things that, I love working in established genres because you just have to suggest the type of genre you're working in, and then everyone's experience with the existing canon just sort of fills in, and you can play with the variations on it, whether you're talking about space travel or vampires or whatnot. You just have to say, yes, we're in a zombie story, but this, and then that's 90% of the way there already.
I was thinking about when you were talking, Tiffany, about right, you have a space you need to fill and you envision it for the space. I also think that there is something with theater, talking about adaptation and like, you're already, if you want a show to have more than one production, you're already having to deal with adaptation, because I remember when I wrote 200 Dream of Electric Sheep for Three-Legged Dog, so they wanted me to come in and do it. I think I had the idea before, but they told me they wanted me, and then from then on, this script was like, my thought was, what can I do with in the Three-Legged Dog space with the Three-Legged Dog projector situation and the three-legged, everything was written for that. And I originally hadn't been sure. I was considering doing the Brick, which would have been such a different script and conception. I mean, maybe not as different as I think, but conception wise and how I was writing it and like, writing like the scenes. And then Sacred Fools came along and they said they would like to do the script. And I sent the script to the director and he kept like writing to me. He's like, what is going on in this scene? Like, how is this, how does this work? I don't understand. I was like, oh, well, here's how we did it. But, you're going to have a totally different space and a totally different, like, you just have to adapt it. I don't expect it to be the same thing. And so I think that there is, just a natural like instinct to like find the thing that works in a particular place in a particular form that goes on in theater anyway. And any Shakespeare is an adaptation because it's not happening in the Globe, unless it is happening in the Globe, but still it's not the same Globe. So
it's not the same Globe, and there are women on stage and all kinds, it's all an adaptation. But I think too, if I can connect that thought, Edward, to what you were saying earlier about the novel of yours that you can't quite imagine in a different medium, I think it also speaks to the nature of collaboration, right? That that there is something about the theatrical form that requires other people to imagine with you, and a sort of shared imaginative venture. And I guess I'd love to just sort of hear a little bit more about how, we've already heard Tiffany a little bit about how you think about the experience for the senses of your productions. Who are your key collaborators when creating sci-fi theater? When do they enter the process, and how does that collaboration unfold?
Are you asking Tiffany? Oh, sorry. Okay. No, I'll be definitely very interested to hear what you say on that. I just the only small thing I can say on this, I had when I wrote the science fiction play that kind of or plays that kind of most completely connected with audiences. It was a trilogy called the Honeycomb Trilogy. It was a trilogy of 3 plays. That was about an extraterrestrial occupation of the Earth, but it was all 3 plays were set in the same living room and sort of dealt with different theatrical genres. Because of I learned something on that process. We did my theater company and I did that project 2 times. 2012, where we did the plays sequentially, and then we brought it back in 2015, where we did them in a repertory fashion with day-long marathons on the weekends. In the process of doing those 2 productions, they changed a lot of how I approach theater. To your question, and there was a lot, before I was like, okay, I am the playwright. I go off into some little room and I do the drafts and the revisions, and then I hand it down from on high, and then you all will take it and go figure out how to produce it. But the time schedule for developing and producing the Honeycomb Trilogy, from the time that I pitched the idea to my theater company colleagues, my co-producers, was so collapsed that I essentially was not just having to share drafts with them as we went along, but even pages, even just scenes, just raw stuff. I would just send them raw stuff over and go, here's the next scene and a half. I have no idea how we're going to produce this, but this is what I'm thinking of. So already everything was having to be done at the same time. So designers were starting to be involved when I barely even had a draft yet. So what started happening was that scenic designers, lighting designers, costume designers were reacting to early ideas that I had, saying, oh, that makes me think, when I design this, I think I might want to do this, or I might want to do a little bit of this. And that idea went into the next draft of the writing. And I think a lot of playwrights have this same revelation in one form or another, where you suddenly realize you aren't actually the center of the world, and you're actually like one person on a team of awesome artists who are putting this thing together. It was something that I think I would have felt very threatened by when I was younger, but I realized, oh wow, sharing the earliest stuff.
Do we lose Mac?
I think we lost him for a second. All right, we'll come back to Mac, I guess. And he is. He looks very engaged.
I guess for me, it all depends on the project of exactly, and I'm not a playwright. I'm a director and a deviser. So I guess devising is the closest I've come to playwriting, but that's like the collaborators come really, really early. So like on Murder on Horizon, I have the plot, but then, you know, I'm pretty much asking for improvisers for characters, and it's very, very open and loose. And then together we kind of collaborate on, you know, what these characters are, where they are in their journeys, and things like that.
Sorry. I'm so sorry. There's some internet interruptions due to the snowstorm. Somebody else is talking. You can keep going.
No, it's fine. You were just frozen in time, so we waited.
No, get.
um,
oh, it's very kind of you.
Yeah, but yeah, I think, you know, but then also I've been given, you know, plays, and they're science fiction, and you know, usually the playwright's like, you're like the only place that might produce my work because this is science fiction. I've tried to get this produced other places. They tell me it's unstageable. And we're like, that's our favorite play. Give it to me now. We love the Unstageable play. You are, yes, checked all the boxes. And then it's just a collaboration between me and the playwright of like, how can we stage these unstageable things? But you know, every time someone says something is unstageable, I go back to Midsummer Night's Dream, or you know, like that's the fantasy forest. How come that's possible, but the space station isn't? Like, you know, I just feel like sometimes people, you know, he turns in, his head turns into an ass. How do you do that? They've been doing that for, you know, hundreds of years. So I just think that sometimes people put science fiction in this box, and it can be so much more than what they think of this box. And that's kind of like the joys, right? Like, that's what I like to figure out. Like, how do we go to hyperspace? Like, how do we go to warp in this play? What does that look like outside in the windows? So yeah, like those challenges are kind of, I think, the things that are really cool. And then when audiences see your interpretation of that moment, they're like, oh my God, we're in warp speed. And then like some people clap, and it's like, oh, this is so great. Theater is the best.
For a long while, one of my main collaborators was Henry Acona, who's both a composer and director, and all of my science fiction work, and a lot of my other work too, had a strong music component. And that really sort of filled it in a different way. And it had sometimes elements of opera or musical theater, but sometimes it was just a score to it or whatever it was. And those were also pieces that spanned a lot of locations, and it sort of created a wholeness in it, as this sort of like these little scenes would move in and out, and you had a stage that could sort of accommodate those different locations, and there were a lot of logistics going on. So Henry has sort of taken a step back from theater, and I the last piece I did was Alma, Baya, and I had the idea that I was going to go the opposite way. And first of all, these productions are so complicated and so exhausting to, like, you know, worry about getting together. I was like, I'm just gonna go to the old like theater standard. Like, we're gonna be in a room, we're gonna have 3 people in a room, and things will happen. And that's all that's gonna be involved. And it's gonna be simple, and my life is gonna be simple, and everything will be easy with it. And then I decided to do it during a pandemic, just to just to screw with it all. But it was interesting because it became, and also because I was doing it during the pandemic, I decided to have 2 sets of actors, because who knows if somebody got sick, you know, what was going to happen. I was like, this is really going to create literally twice as much work, which it sort of did. But, you know, maybe there's an artistic upside to it. And the artistic upside to it was I cast a very different set of actors, and I let go of control of it deliberately. I've never given less direction. I felt like I wanted to see where they went with it. And they went in two very different ways. Like the two productions have completely different feels, and like where the humor hits is different, where the tension is a little different. It's really fascinating, and it was really fascinating to let it evolve. And I had known when I cast them that these are very different sets of actors. One has like one group is a little bit more Pinterest in their approach, and like every pause is embedded with like significance, and there's like, you know, machinations, and like everybody's figuring everyone out. And the other one is just going straight out, you know, like every line is on top of each other. Like, you know, everything is like, you know, popping, like there's humor coming out very quickly. And it was just at one ended up 5 minutes shorter than the other, and like 112 versus 117, and it was really amazing. So I mean, the actors are always the collaborators, but in a certain way I felt like they were in a whole different way. They like took control of the production, and that was really a fascinating experience.
I mean, for me, I've never been commissioned to do something. I've never sort of been in that sort of position. I've always just sent my script into these contests, and occasionally I get chosen and we get read or produced. If I'm so fortunate, then I'm just happy to. And my style is always just, hey, I'm just going to be in this background of the rehearsal room in the corner, just enjoying the fact that these people that are more talented than me in these particular departments are engaging with my work, and just trying to interfere as little as possible, because I just love to see the people who are good at acting and directing and so forth just working on something I wrote. That's just the joy of it for me.
Max, since we lost you at the beginning of this sort of moment of question, is there anything else that you want to add on collaboration, and how you approach that in your work?
What was that? Oh, yeah, sorry. This is just a very short thing. I get because I did may genuinely be useful. Like I said, my wife Sandy was the scenic designer on the 3 Honeycomb Trilogy plays, and like I said, on that third play was about the human race rebuilding, and so a lot of our idea was that the set was now decorated with like old junk from the 21st century that they dug up and was like all over the walls and everything. That was the idea when I wrote the script. But then when I was sitting down to do the final rewrite before we went into rehearsals, my wife was sitting next to me in our apartment, and was working on the set design at the same time as I was doing the final rewrite. And she said, I think I want to have a memorial wall, a rough-hewn wooden, because all modern technology is gone. She said, I think I want to put a rough-hewn wooden memorial wall to like the characters who died in the previous plays, the characters in this play would be motivated to want to memorialize. She said, I think I'm going to put a memorial wall on the set. I think it'll look a little bit like this. And she's sitting right next to me, and she just draws a crude pencil drawing of what the memorial wall would look like. And I was like, oh my God, because there was a scene, nothing is more deadly in theater aside from geniuses like Beckett and Godot or whatever, but nothing's deadlier than characters endlessly talking about offstage characters who aren't there because that's so hard to make vivid. It's so hard to have a couple of characters on stage talk about events you don't see or characters you don't meet. And the third play in this trilogy, of course, had a bunch of conversations about characters who died in previous plays because people grieved them, they missed them. And I was trying so hard to make those conversations feel vivid, despite the fact that they're talking about people that the audience couldn't see. Sandy's idea about the memorial wall suddenly made those characters present in a way that they were not in the script. And I immediately started rewriting several key scenes to incorporate the memorial wall into them. And that led to a moment of um, a major emotional climax towards the end of the play where two different characters who both love and hate each other are having a huge emotional confrontation. They're both really bitter about people who've died, that the other one had a hand in their death. And at a really dramatic moment, they each put their hands on the name on the wall of the people who died, and it made the moment 1,000 times better than it would have been just as a dialogue exercise that I wrote. Talk about staging the unstageable or staging the impossible. This was a moment where letting a design, by luck, it happened to be a designer that I lived with, so I could hear about the idea immediately. But I could funnel the idea directly, the design idea directly into the writing, and it changed how I thought about writing plays. Where I stopped thinking of them as sort of just like writing scripts because, and started thinking about them as creating environments. I started thinking about them as kind of creating live stage environments. I mean, this is a little bit, to acknowledge Greg does it sort of a slightly different thing as a player, because like, Edward and I both like write and then usually have a heavy hand in the production of the writing. So it is a little bit of a different thing, rather than, like Greg, you were saying like about, writing and then sending it off. So I'm not saying that every playwright should necessarily approach it like this, but because I'm a writer producer, it taught me a lesson that I incorporated in my next couple of plays, which was involve the designers as early as possible. Give them pages as early as possible. Start hearing what everyone's ideas are, and then tailor the script to the live experience that's going to happen. That would be great in any play. It wouldn't have to be science fiction, but like what Tiffany's talking about with staging the impossible, it's doubly helpful in a science fiction play to get the designers involved. Obviously, the director would be getting the designers involved as early as possible in the creative process, maybe even before you've finished a draft.
For sure. I love that. I love all of this. And especially, I am someone without a visual, artistic bone in my body. So I'm always in awe of what designers bring to the process. I want to, as two things. First, as we enter our sort of in the latter half of our time this evening, I want to encourage folks who are attending and listening in, drop those questions in the chat. I want to know what you're curious to hear more about, and we'll fold them in as we can. And also, thank you again for being with us tonight. Now, I want to sort of like pivot a little bit to something I've sort of been hearing bubble up a little bit. So Tiffany was saying before we started the webinar how sort of spread out science across the country science fiction theater makers are. We have 3 out of 4 time zones represented tonight. Edward, you were talking about sort of how when you first started out, you weren't calling your plays science fiction plays, because you thought there was a stigma to that. I was listening to a podcast interview with you where you talked about how when you first started out, you didn't think science fiction and theater went together. And so I'm curious, sort of in the broad landscape of American theater, and I will leave you to define that term as you will, where do you see science fiction theater in the midst of that? And as you've sort of progressed along your respective careers, what changes or trends are you noticing? I know that's a huge question, but like, it's something that I am curious about. So that is why I'm asking.
I guess I'll just hop in because I've pretty much, I think I had the privilege of just when I came out, I was like, we're doing sci-fi. That's what it is. If you like science fiction, you're nerding out with us, come nerd out with us. If you don't like science fiction, you might not like it, but it's also about human condition stuff. So if you're into human condition stuff, it's kind of the same. It's paint. So and I think honestly, like we started in 2012, and it's kind of like when Spider-Man and Iron Man were coming out, and like that Marvel universe was starting to develop, and so it was just becoming a lot more in the consciousness, I think, of nerdom. And a lot of my collaborators at the time, like we would go to cons together, we would cosplay. The idea of Otherworld happened in a night when I was up at midnight in line for Skyrim, and I was waiting for Skyrim to be released. And there was this huge line of people being like, oh, I can't wait to go to this world. I can't wait to explore. What are we going to find out in this, video game? And I was like, where's theater for these people? People start talking about how theater's dead. Like that was a lot of what they were talking about when I was in school, that like, oh, it's old people. Like, how are we going to get the new kids? And I was like, here's a whole generation of nerds that love cosplay, love conventions, love meeting their, heroes live. They love dressing up. They're very theatrical people. Let's have theater for them. So how that fits into American theater, well, they're Americans and they're coming. So if you have audiences and then they're Americans, I'm assuming that's what American theater really is, right? I don't really, I don't have my master's. I don't really sit around, and I feel like that's, thinking about what this means. I'm just like, how do I make sure people come to the show? How do I make sure they have a good time? And how do I make sure they come back? And if that is happening, I'm assuming that theater is live and well. And hopefully we're getting younger demographics, we're getting people of color, we're getting, diversity and inclusion. Like I think science fiction has always been above the curve in a lot of different ways. I'm thinking of Star Trek and things like that, always kind of bringing that in and telling those stories. So I think that's, in terms of the conversation, like if people want to stick their nose up at it, that's fine. That's, it's not for you, it's fine. But, in terms of like, is it American theater? Well, it's happening in America, so doesn't it have to be?
And I would jump on because I remember early on getting sort of involved in the particular corner of the theater community that I got involved in, sort of off Broadway indie theater in New York. And I was, in the early days when I was sort of doing one flop after another of incredibly turgid autobiographical plays that I was doing. I remember going to see friends. I heard about the Vampire Cowboys theater company, Qui Nguyen and Robert Ross Parker, and the plays that they were creating together as playwright and director. I remember going to those plays. You would go and sit down before the play started, and it was a completely different energy in the audience. It wasn't like, you normally plays, folks are sitting there going, oh, I think there'll be some very interesting themes in this. Or there'll be a few people that you could just see that they're like half asleep, they've come from work, and they're just like, at Vampire Cowboys plays, everybody was thrumming. Everybody was like, they couldn't wait for the show to start. They were chattering excitedly among themselves. And I was like, I want to make people feel like that. I want people to show up and feel like, now to be fair, obviously some people don't feel that way about genre stuff, and they would not have that energy at a Vampire Cowboys show or something that I made or whatever, or at Otherworld or whatever, but for a lot of people, there was a special excitement. It was like, oh my God, I didn't know plays could do this. And I'm here and I'm excited. I never thought that theater could sort of touch on that kind of like particular geek nerve of excitement. And I was like, I think I know how to make people excited like that, because that's what I feel. That's how I consume storytelling. And it didn't make any sense that I was writing these boring autobiographical plays about my tender emotions when I wasn't going to see anybody else's boring autobiographical plays about their tender emotions. That wasn't anything that I was drawn. Why on earth would I be writing something that I wouldn't go see? So it changed everything when I started writing genre stuff, science fiction, horror, crime thriller stuff. When I made that switch over, it was audiences started liking the plays so much more. My collaborators liked working on them so much more. The sheer joy level really spiked. Now, you talk about the national landscape. I mean, there is definitely, I have noticed that science fiction has gotten a purchase in sort of like the legitimate circuit in the form of like a lot of what I sort of think of as like classy science fiction plays that meet the more typical theater audience halfway. I'm thinking of something like Marjorie Prime or The Nether by Jennifer Haley, or maybe Mr. Burns counts as this. But there's a handful of plays that that use science fiction tropes and themes and funnel them through the kind of like the respectable like 3.5 characters play that is, you know, that is very popular to put on around the country, and that a lot of like theater going audiences that are interested in contemporary writing like to see. And I, you know, it's not what I write. I'm a lot pulpier than those plays, and I know that's why bigger theaters probably tend to be less interested in my stuff. It's the pulpy quotient is kind of unapologetic. But nonetheless, I'm very glad for the existence of those plays. Number one, because I enjoy them, but number two, because I do think hopefully they will be a bridge to theater goers someday, you know, liking the kinds of things, you know, that I make. Now, I don't know, I don't know Greg's new play. It's entirely possible. Yeah, you know, I don't know what the pulp quotient versus respectability, but it's entirely possible. You know, there's another one who's like, the more of these that get into like respectable places, the more I think this will become something that becomes just another accepted genre of theater, and I look forward to that, because I think the more playwrights think of it as an ordinary way to write about theater, the more diverse and interesting approaches there will be to writing science fiction plays.
Yeah, I mean, we do say sci-fi plays, and just sci-fi has such a wide range of things it could be. You know, what I'm doing is I'm using sci-fi as a way to talk about the issues of today, or something like that. You know, a dramaturg suggested that I spend time thinking about the type of warp drive that gets me from Earth to the planet they're traveling to faster. And I thought about it. I'm like, no, there's no solution I could come up with there that would help at all, and distract you from, you know, people having issues with people, which is what my play wants to talk about in the trappings of sci-fi. Now, that's not to say that another playwright could make a play where the technical details of warp drive is the most critical thing on the play and make it interesting. I'm sure some other playwright or other writer can, because it happens all the time in you know, novel written or books sci-fi. But yeah, there are a whole wide range of sci-fi that can commute, that can migrate to the stage if you know, if the thirst for it grows. And you know, it's unimaginable to me that so much space is being taken up in sort of theaters of in movie theaters, sci-fi in one way or another. To think that that can happen, and at the same time, there's no place for it on theater. It's just, it's an interesting thing people want to do. Just think about other worlds and world building, and just letting your mind think like that. So, why shouldn't it happen on stage?
Uh, yeah, I'm trying to think about it because I was I thought of something while Greg was speaking. I was going to say something earlier, but anyway, yeah, I mean, I think to me there has been like a advance in a little bit in the respectability. There's like more and more sci-fi goes into the sort of more mainstream off Broadway, or more mainstream regional, or more mainstream, like whatever it is, like and I think it's partly because there's a discovery of there's an excitement in the audience, with that. And so they want to bring in those audiences, because they're interesting works. And it's just a different way to like approach, especially for theaters who don't do that usually. Suddenly you get a bunch of people saying, well, my goodness, you're I really enjoyed this in a way I didn't expect. So I think that's definitely true. Experimental theater, where I or indie, experimental indie theater, where I began, like my first thing that I did when I came to New York was I assisted Richard Foreman, and we're all nerds anyway. Like like that world, it wasn't a big jump. It wasn't a big jump to start talking about sci-fi because we were all talking about it backstage to begin with. And so I mean, there were those who were less into it. And actually Henry, funny enough, collaborated with me on a bunch, but he was not a fan of science fiction coming into it. He sort of got dragged by me into all the science fiction work. And then he would be like, well, this one worked for me because of this, or this one. But most of the people in that world were sort of nerds. And then, but I think there's a huge, there is a huge excitement. And when I did, and like Androids, it was overwhelming. Like the people who were like pouring in, like I think we sold out the run in a week, and people who weren't usually going to the theater, which is something I really loved. And that was, I said, well, I want this audience more. And so that was a giant appeal to me. It's funny when Greg was talking about the world building. One of the interesting, and this maybe goes back to like stage versus books versus other things. I did go into the I guess what Mac would call the more legitimate or whatever, let's pulpy sci-fi with Alma Baya. But the one thing that I found fun about doing it as a theater piece versus like things I was dealing with the novel and feedback I got when I wrote the novel, I left a lot of things unanswered, and the editors found that unsatisfying. And I was like, well, I don't know, I like theater where a lot of things are unanswered. And they're like, yeah, but readers of science fiction books don't want everything to be unanswered. And so then I ended up answering more questions. But in Alma Baya, I left a lot of things unanswered, and everyone was fine with it. And so, I mean, the leftovers actually leaves a lot unanswered in the book, which is sort of interesting. I enjoy that. But but there is a certain sort of play that I get to do, the sort of thing I want that way. Sim.
Listening to you all speak about the sort of where sci-fi theater may be making inroads into more legitimate or respectable theaters, I'm like immediately thrown back to my like undergrad theater management course that was like, every season must have a Shakespeare play and a new play and a musical, right? And I'm like imagining a world now in which like one of the must-haves for each season is a sci-fi play, and a world in which that sort of coexists with genre-specific theater companies like Otherworld, where in the same way that theaters with a wide range of programming will do a Shakespeare play, but like they're not going to do Pericles. If you want Pericles, you have to go across town. Like, how I just want that for science fiction theater now. Oh, sorry, Tiffany, I saw you unmute. Go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to say really quickly, one, Edward said something that was really like science fiction nerds and just nerds in general, best audiences. I'm biased, totally biased, but the energy that they bring and the love that they have, and they want to know, like, you know, you're talking about a talk back that like nobody comes to, the nerds will be there and they're like, how did you stage this? And I read the book and the book said this, so in this moment, why did you do that? And like, they're so engaged, they're fanatical, right? We're fans. And there's that energy there that like I just love, and I'm really blessed that Otherworld gets to interact with that audience every day. Like, nerds, awesome. Another thing that I just kind of wanted to say is that Pillow Man was always my gateway play, that it was legitimized, but people did not say it was science fiction. I was like, how is this not science fiction? They're like, well, it's not, because the playwright says it's not. And I was like, that does that mean that it's not? Like, this isn't another universe, and this world, there's world building, and this world does not exist. And I was like, this is science fiction. This is a science fiction play. And that was legitimate and like, you know, on major Broadway or whatever. So sometimes I'm just like, I don't know. If I think it is, then maybe it is. If it checks enough boxes, I'm like, I'm sorry, you wrote a sci-fi play. It's fine. You're a nerd too. We're all nerds somewhere about something. So yeah, I just had to say those two things because it resonated with me.
I love that. Yeah, no, and I love all the love you've got for audiences. I want to lift up, we've got 2 questions coming into the chat. I want to first lift up Charlotte, who is an undergrad who is currently writing a sci-fi play. That's very exciting. And Charlotte wants to know what you all think are the most effective ways to portray time travel on stage.
I have 2 thoughts on that. I'll be super. I know we're time is tight. My co-producer Sean Williams, who runs both my theater company and my audio company with me, he's written a time travel play that has a wonderful trick for it, where again, as often as you can come back to using the elemental tool of the actor's body, that's a great. That's always a great way to do it. He wrote a play involving time travel where the second that the character who sort of creates the time travel perfects it, it immediately transforms the personalities of everyone in the show, because the invention of the time travel immediately leads to the changing of the history, and a character goes from this kind of like you know, kind of carefree, wide-eyed teenage girl. She immediately transforms into this like vicious survivalist who is like wants to know. She immediately, her first line is, "Do you have any clean water?" Her entire life has just been transformed by the invention of time travel, which when she says, "Do you have any clean water?" you immediately autofill in your mind, "Oh, something terrible has been happened to change the past, and there's now some kind of horrible, you know, privation in this area." Another one that I would simply say is very straightforwardly is that the storehouses of big theaters everywhere just contain time travel in them. You can put it. There are costumes going back the decades and centuries that you can simply mix people together. You could create one of those bog standard living room sets with a nice sofa set in 2022, and then you can have someone in full Edwardian costume come running across it. We have time travel sitting in our storage.
Yeah, my most popular 10-minute play that I've written involves time travel and just a character showing up on stage saying, "I'm your daughter from the future," and then she does something to change the future, and then she disappears from the timeline, and then she reappears 2 minutes later in a different costume saying, "Now I'm your daughter from the future. Your life is different in this way." And, you know, it could be simple as that, or if you want to, you can do effects or whatever, but, you know, it depends on the play you're writing and what you want to do. You know, do you have access to a DeLorean that goes 88 miles an hour? If you do, go ahead and use that.
guess I have my director hat on with this question, but I would always like I'm not knowing the play at all. Obviously, it has to serve the play, and so time travel can be a bunch of different things. So my first question is to break it down: is this something that is internally manifested in the character, or is this more environmental? Because if it's the character, you can slow everything down and pinpoint around that character as they time travel and make it very all about stillness and the breakdown of the environment around them. Or if it is environmental, like is it more like a chaotic switch where it's Dorothy in the tornado house? But yeah, so I would just ask yourself that question, and also just write. Like, don't worry about so much of it if it's stageable or not. Like sometimes I feel like that's a boundary where the playwrights are like, oh, I want to write the scene, but I don't know if it's stageable. Just write what you love and have that passion come through, tell your story, and then get a director that is a nerd and be like, how do we stage this together?
As a playwright, just being able to think that's the director's problem is very freeing. The greatest stage direction I ever. Cassandra fades from a distance. Pause.
I mean, going back to Ionesco, one of my favorite things he would do is he would write these stage directions, and was like, "That's just impossible. I want to try to figure out how I would possibly do that moment." And so, I mean, it can be exciting as a director to get an impossible stage direction. I just brought my nieces to Harry Potter on Broadway. They had plenty of time travel, and they had the coolest stage effect that if anyone knows how it's done, they made the whole space shimmer as it like it was like we're looking through a desert at like heat through a desert, and like there was no scrim. I don't know what they did. They figured out something. It was really, I was just fascinated with that special effect. And having these analog special effects on stage is really, amazing. But you don't have to be able to do that, obviously. There are, the more conceptual, if you want to give the question is, do you want to give the sense of actually time traveling, like the process of traveling, or are you in a different place and just want to give the sense of the new place? It really is, just think about what you want from it, and then write the script to suit that.
I can't resist sort of tagging on before I toss to the next question. This not ever, like, if you can make it shimmer like Harry Potter, amazing, but not a necessity. And my mind is immediately thrown back to The Winter's Tale, since we've already brought up Shakespeare, and you have a character who comes out and looks the audience square in the eye and says, it's 16 years later, we have all traveled, we're in a different time, we're in a different place, you, the audience, have come on this time travel with us, here we go. And then you're off to the second half of that play. But I do want to make sure we have time. So Charlotte, I hope that was helpful, or at least not harmful. And I really wish you much success with your play that you're writing. I want to turn now to Monica's question, which is a super great question. The misconception is often that film and prose are the optimal medium for science fiction. To turn that on its head, are there aspects of science fiction that you think work better on stage than in other mediums? And if so, what?
I think there are two key things that theater. Number one is moral quandary, moral debate. It's funny, a lot of friends of mine who, like, a bunch of friends of mine just randomly at the same time started rewatching Star Trek: The Next Generation a couple years ago. I think maybe it was on Netflix or something like that. And they were theater friends of mine. They're like, a lot of the middle episodes on every season of Star Trek: The Next Generation could be plays with just a few changes, because usually the whole middle of the season before like the space battle started up again would be like really difficult moral quandaries about how to work out a situation inflected by science fiction, and they were usually the drama usually played out with a lot of intense conversations in rooms, which is what theater does best. And you know, I think seizing upon like moral quandaries that could only exist if something extraterrestrial, some extraordinary feat of technology was involved. But it's a moral quandary that reflects back on ones that we live with in the present. Theater is very good at potent, powerful debates and situations where a really tough decision has to be made with time running out. The second thing I would say is transformation. You can obviously have transformation in film and TV, but it's usually achieved by special effects of some sort. When a person, let's say, is taken over by an alien on stage, there's something utterly uniquely awe-inspiring about watching that happen in the moment, about watching a gifted actor completely transform their top-down body language because they have assumed a new identity, a clone, an alien, possession by a demon, a ghost, whatever it is. A live in the moment transformation by a single actor sort of makes it has a kind of a limitlessness to it that is incredible, and to me is more awe-inspiring than the best special effects.
I'm gonna second transformation because that's a huge thing. But also just being present. Like even if it was just an alien that walked on stage and he's, you know, 5 feet in front of you and he's glossy and he's, you know, examining his terrain, you know, being present with that alien in a way that you can't be, you know, in film, I think is really telling. And also the sense of community. I'll also second kind of what Mac was saying with like a Star Trek episode, like Measure of a Man. It's my favorite Star Trek episode of all time. Is Data, does he have personhood, or is he a machine and he's, you know, owned by Starfleet? That is such a great thing. And why I bring that episode up is like, that would be a conversation that would be happening in the lobby, like after the show. Like everyone would be like, well, what do you think of this? And like, they're all at the bar, they're all having drinks, and they're all like having this discussion of like, what exact, like just the people who have come to the show with each other, just having like these debates and discussions. And I don't really see that in a lot of other mediums, like maybe in a book club, if you're reading a book and then you meet about that book, but like, especially in film, you're like, that was a great film. And then you all go on your way. Like, you're not going to like be in the lobby of the movie theater, be like, did you just see that movie? What did you think about it? You'd be crazy. So, you know, that sense of community and like that, like having that relationship with your audience and having those discussions, I think is something that really makes, you know, theater beautiful.
Yeah, and to add to that, I would say so much of sci-fi is about world building and just creating a place that you define. And you know, with theater, you get to trap the audience in that place for 90 minutes or more, depending on how much you're torturing the audience. So yeah, just the ability to make them sit in the audience. They don't have another browser window open. They don't flip channels. They're there because they paid the money to be there, and just being able to take them to the world you're building.
I mean, certainly, like I feel like with Alma, Baya, everybody was in a pod with a poisonous atmosphere outside, and you know that just seems like it should be in a theater. Like nobody can in the stage can go anywhere. More or less, nobody in the audience can go anywhere. Well, we won't stop them if they try to break out. But but that feeling of being in a space together and like connected to that space. And even when it's not like you know, one location, there's also something about that space. You know what I talk about, like writing to Three-Legged Dog. Three-Legged Dog had this hallway that you walk down, this like very sleek long hallway, and then you ended up in like the at the end of it into the theater. And I did a couple of science fiction pieces there, and each time the stage was different, but the like sense of like this world that we're entering is not quite our world, and we're living in that world together with these characters, was really beautiful, I thought. And so I and uh, not to harp on Harry Potter, because I would never thought I would talk about it as like an example, because nobody has that budget. But one thing I actually really did appreciate is everything was on analog, and like there was spontaneous applause with the transformations of like one character into another, and it was like I could, having done little like quirky things, like you could see, I could see how it was done, but like the amazement of it, the amazement of like the magic of it, of the like of just humans doing something that looks a little magical on stage, and like and seeing it happen before for you, and knowing that there's no ability to like do like some sort of film like gloss over and add a digital like change or whatever it is, but like, oh my god, how did they do that? uh or even like, oh, I know how they did it, but my god, they did that well. Which was my reaction to a couple of those things. I'm like, yes, I know that one guy was slipping into the costume while the other guy was slipping out, and I could sort of see it happening, but it was so smooth, and they had that so practiced and then the applause came the second it happened. And so like I think there's a lot to be said about the magic of theater, and creating those moments in theater.
I love that. I love that. Thank you. I feel like I have a renewed appreciation for the things that theater is uniquely qualified to bring to sci-fi theater. We are nearing the end of our time, but there's a question from Aaron in the chat that I do want to take a minute to hear your thoughts on, and then I'll do a lightning round question to wrap us up, and then that will be the end of our time. Aaron's question: sci-fi has historically been a genre that excludes marginalized people from telling those stories, which has started to improve in recent years in literature and film. What can we as sci-fi theater makers do to create equity within our genre?
And as playwrights, we can definitely write plays that are specific to, just don't write generic heroic captain, generic people, assuming white cis people as default human. My play is just very specific in terms of these are the people there. These people are this race for a reason. It occurred to me just last year that Star Trek, original Star Trek, presented a vision of a multicultural group of people working together that were, at the time, your enemies. Russians and Japanese were the enemies at the time of Star Trek's debut, but in the future presented them as working together. There was a black woman on stage. She was originally captain, but then they made William Shatner captain, but that's another thing. But they presented this vision of different people from different backgrounds working together, and then Star Wars came along and cast all white people. And it hadn't occurred to me until last year that happened, and the consequences of that now, when you're trying, when they're in the sequels, they're trying to make a more equitable cast for The Last Jedi and onward, but there's just so much pushback because no, our childhood is that this was our Star Wars, and you're ruining our childhood. It's like, as creators, if we're creating our own world, we can make it how we want, right? So if you're growing up on the comic book series Saga, then you get a very different worldview than if you're growing up on Star Wars, the original Star Wars. And as playwrights and as producers, we can choose to make it specific to reflect the world as we see it right now, and the world we want to see.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Greg. That was really touching, actually. you know, this is obviously a huge conversation. It's not happening in just science fiction. This is happening all over the broad, almost in every art form and every medium. And I do think that, like, you know, during this time, you know, it's been a lot of listening, at least for a person of white like myself, listening to what people of color want to see from their genres, and, you know, being open to those debates, giving them a platform, I think is something that, you know, we are really looking to do in this upcoming year, Otherworld Theater, trying to, you know, facilitating work that is not Western sci-fi, and more multiculturally sci-fi, like Afrofuturism, you know, so I think that, like, right now we're in a place of building, because they haven't had a platform for a really long time, and so it's more like cultivating that work, finding that work and cultivating it and then producing it. Like we're definitely talking about right now having a Otherworld writing group, where we're facilitating science fiction writers just to write, that are of color, and just, you know, write their stories from their perspective. Because again, like, even though the tales I love Star Trek, love it to pieces, but it is like a very Western white tale. And we're missing out, really. Like, it's us. We're missing out on all of these different stories that we could be appreciating and enjoying and cultivating understanding by, you know, letting more writers, more directors, more actors of color at the table. So that's something that, you know, personally, that's what we're working towards. But everyone's journey is different. Every theater's journey is different.
You're gonna say?
Oh, sorry, you go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the advantages of sci-fi theater being so young is that we don't, I mean, we have the burden of, you know, Western culture and the burden of the history of other forms of sci-fi. It's not quite as imminent in terms of, like, you know, there aren't these classic science fiction theater pieces that we're trying to navigate in the same way. And science fiction has often been about a sort of utopia, imagining utopia. I mean, it's not, or dystopia, but, you know, some imagining a world, right? And so there's a freedom of imagination and trying to create something, a world that you want as a result. And so, you know, like as Greg said, as playwrights, we have like the ability to create characters or create situations that fill into that. And I also think that there's you know, because you're working in a world that's an imagined world, like it's a choice not to have, you know, a diverse cast. It's a choice not to, you know, like there's no, like there's nothing that you can look at and you know, usually and say that person is definitely, you know, there's a need for, you know, this very you know, white whatever cis male, you know, world that we're having, unless there's a particular, you know, so there's a lot of freedom if people choose to take it. So I think that's something that appeals to me with the science fiction.
I mean, just you know, as a there are certain things you can sort of obviously do. Like, okay, as you're uh, if you're sort of like a cisgender white male straight writer like I am, you can obviously you can write plays that and or audio dramas that try to bring in a more diverse range of topics. You can and then if you're also a producer, as I sometimes am, you can put a lot of effort into making sure that you have a diverse range of colleagues and that you listen to them even when it challenges some of the ideas in the script, you know, that you had been cherishing previously. But one of the most definitive things that somebody like me can do, and as all of you who've been watching this webinar can tell, that this is a quite difficult thing for me to do. But one of the most important is to kind of not hog the mic all the time. One of the most important things that somebody like me can do is kind of back off a lot of the time and let a lot of other voices into the foreground and taking up the space, taking up the discourse space, the performance space, setting the setting the itinerary of what's being talked about. So a lot of it is sort of like knowing that I was born and raised as a very privileged person with an instinct to kind of go da 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 da, look at me all the time, and learning to actually turn that off and move into the background for long stretches of time and let other people who say things that might challenge or make me uncomfortable, learning not to take up the space that could potentially go to those people is a very important thing, I think, to cultivate. And that for an egomaniac like me is something that I do constantly have to struggle with and make sure that I attend to.
Thanks, y'all. Before we'll wrap up in just one moment, I do want to thank Josh for the accountability check in the chat, reminding us in the specific case of Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling, but reminding us that art and how it is made doesn't exist in a vacuum, and we should all be responsible as we make art and consume art. So thank you for that, Josh. Final question, lightning round, shameless plug. What are you doing that we should know about?
I'll go first, I guess. My play Last Ship of Proxima Centauri is being produced by Portland Stage Company in Portland, Maine. There's going to be an in-person live production, COVID willing, March 2 to 20. And also there's going to be a streaming option that sort of skews a little later than 2 to 20. I don't have it in front of me right now, but you can watch a filmed version of it at your home. I see Anne's put that in chat. And it will be kick-ass.
Let's all raid Greg's play. If you want to follow the work that Otherworld Theater is doing, the best way is just to follow us on socials, where we have so much going on that I won't bore everyone with all the details. But yeah, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We have a YouTube channel if you want to see some of our past work. You can find all of that at otherworldtheater.org, which is in also the chats.
I probably won't have anything new for a while because we're in production on a bunch of things, or development, or various stages. I don't have anything theatrical that's definitively coming up. There's some things that might or might not. But if you go to Gideon-Media, I'll just type it into the thing. Gideon-Media.com. You can find a bunch of my audio dramas, or links to where you can listen to them for free on any number of podcast platforms. They're not science fiction theater, but they are science fiction stories with a lot of the ideas that I've discussed in this panel, and they're all free. Most of them are ad free, and they're fun, and you can listen to them wherever you are.
So I have Alma Baya going for a couple more weeks on demand, so you can definitely check that out. And then and there's also some podcasts that are still up, that if you want to see that stuff. I'm going to London and doing a piece, The Marriage of Alcibie Toglitz by Gertrude Stein. So if anybody's in London at the German Street Theater in March or April, go and check that out. But yeah, that's the current current lineup.
Well, I will be checking all of these things out, and I encourage our attendees to as well. We are well past our time, but y'all are such fascinating, inspiring folks that I just couldn't cut you off. But it is time. The moment has come. We will say farewell. Huge thank you, Edward, Greg, Tiffany, Mac. What a joy it has been to be part of this conversation. And hopefully I'll see you around the Zoom sphere or real life soon. Good night, y'all. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Everyone.